you tell us your story of living all over the world and then eventually making your way to L'Abri and becoming a Christian there, and just telling us what L'Abri was like, what Schaeffer was like, and tell us about that.
Yeah, L'Abri is French for the shelter, and it was the name of Francis Schaeffer's ministry, which was largely apologetics. You know, it was answering intellectual questions that young people had, and I ended up there because I was raised in a Lutheran home, but it was a very ethnic home. My parents were Scandinavian. My mom's Norwegian, my dad's Swedish. So it's a little bit like, you know, all Italians are Catholic. So all Scandinavians are Lutheran. And so there was not, I would say there was not a lot of real fervid commitment in my family. And so when I was in high school, about halfway through high school, I started asking questions. I just started asking, how do we know it's true? You know, I'm attending a public high school, so all my textbooks are secular, all my teachers are secular, and I just start wondering, how do we know Christianity is true? And unfortunately, nobody in my life could answer that question. I asked a university professor, point blank, why are you Christian? He said, works for me. I said, you're a university professor and that's all you've got? And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as if it was a psychological phase that I would just outgrow. And so about halfway through high school, I decided maybe Christianity just didn't have any answers. And I very intentionally walked away from my Christian upbringing and started on a very conscious search for truth. I decided it was up to me to find out. My goal was to survey all the religions and philosophies of the world and decide which one was true. And actually, that's how I started studying philosophy. I walked down the hallway to the library at the public high school I attended and started pulling books off the philosophy shelf, because I thought, wow, if I can't find any adults to talk to me about this, isn't that the job of the philosophers, to answer questions like, what is truth and how do we know it? And is there a meaning to life? And is there a foundation for ethics? Or is it just true for me, true for you? And I very quickly concluded that if there was no God, then the answer to all those questions was no. There's not a meaning to life. There's not a foundation for ethics. And I realized there was not even a foundation for knowledge. And what I mean by that is I thought, well, if all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of space-time history, then what makes me think I could have some sort of transcendent, universal, absolute truth? Ridiculous. And that's how I thought of it as a 16-year-old. Ridiculous. So by the time I graduated from high school, I was already a very confirmed relativist, skeptic, even determinist, because my science classes taught me we were just complex machines anyway, operating by natural forces. So it was a couple of years later that I ended up at L'Abri in Switzerland. We had lived overseas when I was a child, and so I had gone back to Germany. And I ended up at L'Abri, which is in Switzerland. And that was the first time I'd ever encountered any Christians who talked about apologetics, who showed that there could be good reasons, arguments, evidence, who could engage with the secular isms that I had absorbed by that time. And I was blown away. I was shocked. I had no idea that there were Christians who could engage with these kinds of philosophical, intellectual questions. In fact, I was so blown away that I left after a month. In other words, I was afraid of being drawn in emotionally. It was so attractive. You know, not only were they answering the intellectual questions, which is the most important thing, but they also, Schaeffer was known for endorsing the arts, right? I mean, that's the term cultural apologetics was coined to describe what he did, because he looked at how ideas percolate down through cultural forms like literature and music and movies and art. Yeah. And I was studying violin. I was studying violin at the conservatory in Heidelberg, Germany. So the fact that he cared about the arts was really big for me. And many people who were there said it was also the quality of Christian community that was almost as impressive as the apologetics. In other words, we saw a form of community and love and Christian love that we'd never experienced back home. And so the upshot was, I felt very emotionally drawn, and I did not want to become a Christian on emotional reasons, because Christianity had already let me down once. And so I was not going to come back unless I was intellectually convinced it was true. So I left L'Abri and just continued studying apologetics until I was convinced. And a year and a half later, I went back to L'Abri. And that's where I stayed for 5 months and became, was it 4 months? 4 months plus the 1 month earlier is 5 months. That's where I really got grounded in Christian worldview. And if you read my books, you'll see they all reflect in some way the influence of Schaeffer's thinking, though I try to take it further, expand it, apply it for our own day. But that was it is the reason I became a Christian. So I can't say I became a Christian at L'Abri, because it was actually in between my 2 trips. But it was definitely because of L'Abri that I became a Christian.
Yeah. So how did L'Abri work? What was an average day like over there? How was the teaching done and the life done together over there?
Yeah, so it started very organically. Nobody said, hey, let's have a residential ministry where we have people come live. Instead, it started out with when Schaeffer's three daughters were old enough to go down the mountain, right there in the Swiss Alps, to go down the mountain to the Lausanne University. They would talk to their friends, and their friends would have questions about God. And they would say, hey, you need to talk, you should talk to my dad. He's really good with those kinds of questions. And so they would take that little train up the mountain. You've seen those pictures of the trains that go up the Swiss Alps. And because it was so inaccessible, they would generally spend the weekend. And then they would tell their friends, and new students would come up the next weekend. And then other students would come up the next weekend. And pretty soon, the Schaeffers had people sleeping on their couches in their hallways and their balconies, and it sort of morphed very organically into a residential ministry, as people who often who had been converted at L'Abri would say, well, we'd like to join this ministry, so they would buy the chalet down the street. I say chalet because that's the kind of houses people live in the Swiss Alps. It sounds like a luxury home, but it's not. It's just what they live. Farmers live in chalets. So they would buy the chalet down the street, and eventually L'Abri was, it's just a group of homes scattered through a little Swiss farming village. And you would live with a Christian family and actually, participate in the daily chores. So you'd study, it eventually developed where you'd study half a day and you'd participate in the daily chores for half a day. So you really were a member of the community. And many nations, you may know this, it's very common that they have a 3-month tourist visa. And so what happened is a lot of people would come there and they'd spend their 3 months and then leave. So it's almost like a semester abroad. So it was, but the emphasis was always on, yes, you're here to study, but you're also here to actually see what Christian community looks like. And you probably have read Schaeffer's book, Love is the Final Apologetic. The Mark of the Christian is the title. And he argues there that love is the final apologetic. And that was really an important part as well, that you live with a Christian family. In other words, Schaeffer wasn't just a talking head, who came in and spoke at a conference behind a lectern and then, jets off back to Switzerland. He was somebody that you saw day in and day out, and how he interacted with his own family and with the students and so on. So it really was a very holistic kind of witness.
Yeah. And what was Schaeffer like?
Since being at L'Abri, I have worked in other ministries and obviously since becoming a Christian. And I have to tell you, over the years, I've actually come to appreciate Schaeffer more. He was the real deal. That's how my husband puts it. He says, he was the real deal. He was authentic. He couldn't hide anything because you're living in his home. Right? So I would say he was probably the most authentic person that I've known in terms of like somebody who was in Christian ministry and well known. He was warm, he was personable, he was easy to talk to. He was overtly caring about people. He was that kind of a person. I also went to a L'Abri conference once after I'd come back to the States, and somebody asked him, "Do you consider yourself a philosopher or a theologian?" And he said, "I'm an evangelist." And I thought, that's it. That captures it. He really was an evangelist at heart. That he had a passion for helping people find God, connect to God, and that I thought that captured well his true heart.
Yeah. And before we move on from that stage of life, we were talking before, and I shared with you a frequent guest on our show has been Os Guinness, and he's had he's also one who's had a major impact on my life, and you got to be there at the same time as him. I've talked to him before about L'Abri and all, and so what was Os like as a young man?
Well, you're going to have him on your show again, so I better be careful. No, we were all very impressed with Os. So the first time I was at L'Abri, Os was still single, and he was one of the lecturers. And when I went back the second time, he was married to Jenny, and was still one of the lecturers. But we were all very impressed with Os because he was one of the better lecturers there. Schaeffer would lecture regularly. Schaeffer would also hold Saturday night discussions. That was kind of a regular thing. And then there were a couple of staff members who were regular lecturers. Everyone loved it when Os was the lecturer because he was so good at it. And he, well, of course, we all loved his British accent too.
Yeah.
But he would. I'm remembering, for example, after all this time, I am still remembering how he would talk about how every secularism, rationalism, materialism, empiricism, all have some core truth because we're all made in God's image and we all have to live in God's world, and so we all discover some truth. And he talked about existentialism in particular, and he said, Christianity should be the best form of existentialism, just like it is the best empiricism, because God made our five senses, and so in order to interact with the world that He made, so of course we value the empirical realm. Empirical science got its start in many ways from Christianity. Because of that, ancient Greeks didn't value the senses. Plato and Aristotle didn't value the senses. That was not an adequate, reliable form of knowledge. So it was Christianity that said, yes, we trust our senses because God made them that way. Made us with our senses to know the world. Anyway, we should be the best rationalist because, Jesus is the Logos. We should be the best naturalist because nature was made by God and we respect it. And anyway, that night he was focusing on existentialism, and I raised my hand. I was not a Christian yet. This was the first time I was at L'Abri, and so I raised my hand and I said, "What do you mean? What do you mean Christians should be the best existentialist?" And so he talked about this sort of day by day walk with God. How as Christians we don't just believe an abstract intellectual system, but it's a living daily experience as we make our decisions, because existentialism focuses on how we make our decisions day by day. In a sense, we create our life through the decisions we make. And, well, that's a very Christian insight. We do, in fact, in a sense, create our life by day-to-day decisions that we make based on God's revelation, based on God's presence in our life. And there are times when we don't know what's... Scripture gives general principles, but there are times when we don't really know what God's will is for this particular point, or what the right thing to do is. And so in that sense, the sort of existential reality of day-by-day decision-making, day-by-day living, So he was using, he was being provocative, of course, we should be the best existentialist. But his point was that we do, in fact, have to trust God moment by moment. It's not just a one-shot deal. Okay, I became a Christian, now I live under my own, rational understanding. No, moment by moment, we have to be making decisions based on God's truth.